Right, so my back catch cover, back catch release cover, and get this assembled. These are always entertaining, trying to get the components together. The spring, you're relying on the spring tension to hold everything in position while you get this in place. Now I can see here that this spring is extra springy and does not want to do the job. And it just sprung off. Alright, I'll have to find it. Now you can all stop looking, it was not very far away at all. So basically you have to put a screw up through the cover and fit the spring in between the screw and the lever, and lift this into position without disturbing either, and getting that screw run down without that spring getting out of position, because if the spring gets out of position it'll get underneath the moving plate and then it'll be very stiff in its action if it moves at all. That feels good. I'm just checking the action as I go here. Tighten those two screws down. That's it. That's the base of our camera dealt with. And all the rest of our action now is, apart from the shutter, is at the top of the camera body. Oh, at least I'm making some progress. The next thing I need to do, the shutter. I think I'll service the shutter. So here I have the shutter. Just remove the rear group. It should just be finger tight. You shouldn't need to use a tool to get that off. Occasionally you might need to if somebody has been over enthusiastic, but generally there's no call for it. Here's the adjustment shims. The front, just unclip that, the front lens group is bayoneted on. And this, I strongly suspect, has never been serviced. Alright, zoom in a bit. That'll do. A screw holds the front retainer ring, locks the front retainer ring in position. It's a very small, very shallow screw. I'm pleased to have that off in one piece without having scratched anything. The retaining ring is just screws on. I use a toothpick to unscrew that, because that way I'm unlikely to damage anything. If you use the tip of a screwdriver you can always slip and make a mess of it. So I'm removing the front rings. These all have a fairly unused look to them. This is our flash, our shutter speed settings cam ring. Right, start getting into the guts. Remove this little latch. That's latched. Its job is to stop you being able to depress the shutter release lever, which of course would also reset the film advance unless the shutter is actually cocked. Now that lever's reluctant to lift out. Why? Spring's in the wrong place. Okay. The spring has been wound around the other side of that post there. Normally the spring in a 3C is up against this side of the case here. Someone has stretched it right round the inside there. That was the practice with reflex models, where I think they wanted extra return spring. Now this little cam here is a bit dirty looking, very unusual. It's the sort of internal cocking ring there. I'll remove the main drive cam and its spring. I'm interested to see the state of that. Yeah, that's absolutely pristine. That's what they should look like. I'll just zoom you right in, see if we can get any joy out of this. See if this will focus well enough. I don't know if it will or not. Zoom you in a bit more. Yeah. See the relationship of these 2 points on the spring. Now if you were to take this piece facing here at 12 o'clock, that's the piece sitting flat on the bench, the little upright there is at about the 2 o'clock position. That's what those springs look like when they were new. I very rarely see them like that. Much more frequently they are somewhat tired, so that if one end of the spring was taken to be at 12 o'clock, the other end of the spring is right round between 3 and 4. Once they reach the 4 o'clock position or close to it, they become problematic. When the shutter blades are in the almost closed position, there is almost no tension on that spring, and as a result any stickiness in the shutter means that the shutter blades are prone to sticking open slightly. Unfortunately, there are no new springs available. My stock of new springs went many years ago. What I have now are ones that I've scavenged from parts cameras, and they're in various states of usefulness. Right, well I'm going to have to remove this bracket here to get that shutter release lever out because the spring is tucked around behind that plate. Now that's unusual, and that's just odd. I've never seen that done on a 3C. I will look at the serial number of the shutter and see if it really is. Yeah, that doesn't really want to come up easily. That spring is just ridiculously tight there. It may have even been bent up. That's just not right. Oh, it's got an extra bend in it. Someone's done naughty things there. I wonder whether Kodak had their spare parts shutters right from the time the 3 big C's were a production item, or whether they got their shutters from Compur, who had old shutters on the shelves or enough parts to make old shutters. I don't suppose we'll ever know. Right. That style of return spring on the B lever and the settings lever for the flash sync speed is entirely normal for a production line Retina IIIC big C. Nothing unusual about that. Only odd thing I found was that spring on the shutter release, and I really don't like the look of that. Oh, we might put it back together like that because that's how it came. It's not how I'd normally do it. If the cameras, if they really were using spare parts, it's possible that the shutter was serviced before it was installed. That would certainly make sense to me. If the shutter had been serviced before it was installed, and if it had been serviced by someone who was not familiar with that model of shutter, and was in fact more familiar with working on reflexes, they may have done something odd like had been done to that spring. It used to be said that shutters needed to be serviced as often as every 5 years to remain in top working condition. Well, you could easily stretch that to twice that for reasonable working condition. So you'd want to service your shutter reasonably once every decade or so. Right, I'll flip this over. I've got the pieces I need from the top there. I need to remove this from the case. 3 screws. Now there's a scratch on the case at that point. Got the tip of a tool's run across it. I wonder whether you could do that if you were assembling a new shutter, whether that would be something that you'd likely to do. Get the shutter case off. Here we have the curved rack and the pusher that the rack moves. Let's pop those to one side. Let's get another container here. And here's the inner shutter case. Put these pieces separately where I can easily see them, because they'll be going back on fairly quickly. These parts are quite dirty. It's a bit of a film of oil on there. We'll see what state this diaphragm's in. I'm just going to move that. That moves freely enough. I can see some marks on that diaphragm. Those marks are very likely going to stay even after they're cleaned, because quite frequently they do. And the shutter blades, the action here is very stiff. Certainly that needs serviced. The point here on the blade actuating ring, typically you would have a touch of lubricant on there. I typically use molybdenum paste. In the past, graphite grease was commonly used there. There's no grease on that, and that may well be the point of stiffness in the action. Yeah, I've just unhooked that spring and the action freed up quite nicely. I'd say that should have been lubricated and was not. That shutter would never have run particularly well, and certainly with a year or two on it, it would have run very badly. Right, I can split this case. It's got 3 screws at the back here. Now that screw head is slightly damaged, and it's damaged in the direction it would be if you were unscrewing the screws. That tells me that the shutter has been disassembled before, which ties in with my hypothesis that the shutter was serviced prior to it being installed on the camera, because it was old stock. Here's the shutter case. I'm removing the 3 screws that hold the retaining plate here for the diaphragm blades. and I'll tip those blades out. There's a fair few marks on that plate. I don't know whether you can see it. Those are etched in fingerprints, and it means that somebody has grabbed that probably between finger and thumb, and the perspiration or skin oils have etched into that blackened surface. It's not at all uncommon. You can see a certain extent there's a fingerprint on there as well. It's quite a common thing. Normally you would put that down to clumsy repair technique. In practice it may well have been down to clumsy assembly technique when the shutters were new. Anyway, my video camera is grizzling strongly and it's almost lunchtime, so I'm stopping right at this point. Well, I've been cleaning these components off camera and I'm about to reassemble the diaphragm here to start off with. The shutter certainly needed to be serviced. It's unusual in that there has been very little lubrication done in the shutter. More commonly, too much lubrication's been done in shutters. In this case, far too little had been done. I don't think it would ever have worked well, and certainly odd things had been done. I've already mentioned that the shutter release lever, the spring was on the wrong side of its normal position. That was certainly intentional, and the spring had actually been reshaped to make it work better in the position that it had been put. It was an odd thing to do. I suspect whoever did it because they were more familiar with working with the reflex shutters, where that spring would have been fitted exactly as it had been fitted here. Certainly an odd thing to discover. So I've cleaned the case. That can fit over the top of those blades. Hopefully nothing's popped out of place while I've been talking. It looks like it's okay. I'll get the 3 screws in place that hold this retainer plate down. Do the screws up very lightly. If a blade has become displaced while I was lifting the case over, you do not want to trap a blade in the wrong position. You could end up with a blade could get bent or damaged in some other way. So you need to make sure that everything is seated correctly before you tighten the screws up. Otherwise there could be weeping and gnashing of teeth. That's good, that's moving very freely. Let's do those 3 screws up. Typically no lubrication is required here unless there's a little undue stiffness. Sometimes there will be undue stiffness because the blades are distorted slightly. That happens if the blades get oily and they stick together, and then you're forcing the aperture lever. That can cause the blades to become distorted and then they don't move freely. Sometimes the answer then is that after the diaphragm has been cleaned particularly well and assembled, you run some graphite powder in there and work it in really well and blow it out really well to make sure there's no loose powder about. and that will often make an otherwise reluctant diaphragm move smoothly again. This is fine. I don't need to do any more to that. The mechanism plate. This has all been cleaned. The problem with the mechanism plate would have been lack of lubricant, if anything. There are various methods have been used by various camera repairers at times. Typically, when the shutters were assembled, graphite grease was often used. A little bit of graphite grease would be smeared in here. One of my common practices has been to use graphite powder to do that. Make sure that this is absolutely clean and dry, and use graphite powder and work it in well. That works well. An alternative is to use some molybdenum paste. Wiping a little bit on the blade actuating ring. That can work very well. So there are, as with most things in life, there's more than one way to skin a cat. The proof of the pudding is in the eating. If you've got a method that works, that produces a good result, doesn't appear to be causing any long-term damage, then it's an appropriate method. And as with a lot of things, it's much easier to learn by the mistakes of those who've gone before you than have to make the same mistakes yourself and learn from them. Because learning from your own mistakes is a much more painful process. Though you certainly learn well. This is the bracket that holds the main spring, and this is held in place with a slightly longer screw than its goes in the other two positions. There's not much in it. 1/4 millimetre, something like that. If you mix them up, you could have trouble. Just checking what the action of this is like. Well, it's certainly smoother than it was, and I haven't lubricated it yet, so I expect that that'll improve further still. I'll just lubricate this with a bit of graphite powder and come back. Right, well, I've lubricated that. I'm just cleaning that surface one last time to make sure it's clean, making sure that I've got the blade actuating ring in the blade's open position, and then I'll fit the shutter blades. The shutter blades are all in very good condition. I would say the camera has done very little work, which is hardly surprising. If they were presentation cameras given to VIPs, there's a reasonable likelihood that a good deal of them were never used. Just as likely that the VIPs who got them, I don't know who the VIPs were, may not have been photographers themselves. If they had been photographers, it may well be that they already had something shiny and prestigious in the way of a camera that they preferred to use. So a lot of these would have ended up stuck in the back of a cupboard somewhere, I would think. Right, there's all the blades in position, and I can put the case on now. If I can get it correctly positioned. Where are we? There, there, there. The case only goes on in one position. These screws go through the back of the case, of course, into the mechanism plate and hold this assembly together. As with the diaphragm blades, start the screws, get them seated, don't do anything uptight until you've tested to make sure that the blades are in fact correctly seated and working correctly. Then go back and tighten those 3 screws up. That's much better. It was pretty reluctant to move prior to cleaning and lubrication. Now there are a couple of spots that need to be lubricated. On the detent spring here, which of course was absolutely devoid of any lubrication previously, and 2 points here need to be lubricated. This is where the drive cam picks up the blade actuating ring and moves it anti-clockwise and then clockwise back to the rest position. That's good. Okay, so those are all done. You can start reassembling the control gear on the top of the shutter, and that always starts with putting the springs back in place. And one spring in particular is very good at getting away. I normally hold a toothpick over the shaft so that it can't jump away while I'm stretching it round into position. Got to pick up that loose end of the spring, carry it over the top of that stud and hook it behind it. And it immediately unhooked. So I've got to get this back in position again, have another go. You need good tweezers for this job. Unfortunately my tweezers, even though I spent some time reshaping them, are not really very good at the moment. That's it. That's in position, so this lever's sprung loaded, this lever's sprung loaded. The B lever can go in, and the B lever spring can go in. So I will just clean those here off camera.